Welcome to the Pick Six Podcast, everybody. Will Brinson is out this week, but all 32 continues. It's me, Ryan Wilson, filling in for old Willie there. Today, we have Stephen Holder of The Athletic. He's going to join us to talk about the Colts. You can follow Stephen at HolderStephen on Twitter. And, Stephen, thanks so much for joining us, man.
Hey, I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, so last year for the Colts was a little interesting. Jacoby got hurt, suffered that knee injury, and things didn't go quite as well as some people had expected. So they made some moves this offseason. There were some conversations about maybe they might get a quarterback, but instead they traded that pick to San Francisco, 13th overall for DeForest Buckner. But they got Phillip Rivers, which I think is probably – Phillip feels like, for me, the best fit for what the Colts can do. You know, we were talking about at some point this offseason, maybe Tom Brady would be that guy. That clearly didn't happen. So I want to talk and start with Phillip Rivers. What are your thoughts on, first of all, him coming to Indianapolis based on what we saw last year? Andrew Luck retires, Jacoby Brissett struggles with the injury, and what that means for 2020 for this offense?
Well, I think we have to start where you just mentioned, which is Andrew Luck's retirement, right? So they went from not thinking about quarterback in the short term to quarterback being their primary issue. So I think when you look at it in that context and through that prism, given where they came from and the circumstances, the hand they were dealt, they're in a pretty good spot considering, to be able to kind of get through last year. You had, probably definitely one of the better backups in the NFL in Jacoby Brissett, a borderline starter based on how he performed, but, was able to at least give him a shot. And then this year, they feel like they've upgraded. Now, Phillip Rivers is 38. He isn't the same player he was 5 or 6 years ago. I grant everyone that, and I firmly believe that is true. But I do think he gives them what they're looking for. And they're looking for more big plays. They're looking for a little more aggressiveness in the offense. They want to score more points. And Phillip's approach to the game gives them the opportunity to do those things. So for all of those reasons, I think in its totality, looking at everything, this is probably as best as you could expect the Colts to do under the circumstances.
I feel like Phillip Rivers, in addition to some of the other moves they made, but Phillip Rivers makes this team a legit contender in the AFC South. I don't even know that. I mean, yes, we know about Deshaun Watson and Houston. We know about the Titans, obviously, and what they did last year. But when you look at this offense on paper, number one of the things that Phillip Rivers struggled with was having to throw the ball in 0.3 seconds because that offensive line was so bad in Los Angeles. It feels like it's so much better now. We know he had playmakers around him in Los Angeles. But let me ask you quickly, how important do you think the additions of Michael Pittman and Jonathan Taylor are, the 2 second-round picks, in terms of what that means not only for Phillip Rivers, who has a huge target in Michael Pittman, some people have sort of compared to Mike Evans, and also Jonathan Taylor helping that running game?
I really like those picks. They weren't the picks maybe that I was predicting. I thought we knew Pittman was on the radar, and we knew that wide receiver was clearly one of their biggest needs. I didn't see Jonathan Taylor coming. I will be the first to admit that one stunned me. But the more I have sort of had a chance to let this digest, I like those two picks. Look, they did a couple things. They did, number one, they addressed a huge need at wide receiver. That was one of their biggest problems last year. I mean, they got a ton of injuries at the position, but they also needed more juice there. Michael Pittman gives you that. He's a pro-ready prospect. I don't know what his numbers will be this year, but I know he'll be able to contribute, and the Colts can confidently say that. And then, on the other hand, they had at running back, you had a really strong position where you had a 1,000-yard rusher in Marlon Mack, a really well-rounded and productive running game. And what did they do? They doubled down, and they went and got a big-time running back, a 2,000-yard guy from the University of Wisconsin. So I really think that you can do a couple of things. You can approach your offseason by, making your strengths stronger, and you can also, solidify your weaknesses. Those two picks enabled them to do both. And, we'll see. It's all, sort of hypothetical right now, but I think you're talking about two pro-ready prospects, a lot of college experience, maybe a lot of mileage in the case of Jonathan Taylor, but definitely someone who won't have to carry the entire load. Marlon Mack's still here. We'll see if he gets re-signed, but for now, he's here and will be here for 2020. So I think they have injected a lot of juice into their offense, and Phillip Rivers will have at his disposal a lot of things that Jacoby Brissett did not last season, including healthy wide receivers that they already had on the roster. So I think this offense, I agree with you. I think this offense positions them to really play with anybody in this division and anybody, for the most part, in the AFC outside of Baltimore and Kansas City. I think being the elites, I think anybody. I think this team can play with anybody in the AFC. Whether they get there, we'll see. But certainly, I would consider them a threat to everyone in the AFC.
I'm with you on that. I do wonder. I mentioned DeForest Buckner a few minutes ago. Did signing Philip Rivers overshadow that trade for the 13th overall pick? We know Javon Kinlaw was maybe in the conversation until the trade happened. And what does DeForest Buckner bring to this defense that has had flashes of being really good? They've gotten younger. They had Darius Leonard a few years ago win Defensive Rookie of the Year. They got the cornerback last year out of Temple who had an up and down year but should be getting better. So what does Buckner bring to the middle of that defense?
I think it's the missing piece, honestly. Look, last year, the defense was okay. It wasn't as bad as the numbers in some places suggested, and then it wasn't as good in others in terms of what the numbers suggested. So I think they were kind of a middle of the pack defense. But I thought they were a defense that had the potential to be a lot more. And if you look at their first 7 or 8 games, they were a different team. And I think we saw a couple of things. We saw the offensive struggles start to take their toll on the defense. And we saw some injuries on defense, particularly to Kenny Moore, who was just sort of a Swiss Army knife on their defense. And he missed the final 5 games. I think we just saw them start to fade. But really, what I saw was a defense that was trying to overcome the lack of pass rush. And when you have sort of an inconsistent pass rush the way they did, they had Justin Houston get 11 sacks, and he did his part. But Kamoko Toure, who's an up-and-coming pass rusher, missed, I believe, 12 games. So that was a huge loss. You had other guys who didn't develop maybe as much as they thought on a defensive line that they envisioned being pretty deep. And so I think when you add a player of Buckner's stature, first of all, totally agree with you. It was absolutely overshadowed. It was one of the biggest moves in the NFL this offseason. But no one's talking about it because he plays defensive tackle, right? I get it. But in this scheme that they play, the Colts have always said the 3 technique defensive tackle is what is going to really drive this. And I think you can go back to the words of Bill Polian, who has always, and everybody, to Tony Dungy and so forth, who have always talked about this defense, the style of defense, the scheme that they play. If you can generate interior pressure, it changes everything. So they've been talking for a very long time about getting some consistency at that position. And so what they do, they went out and they got an all-pro. So it's better than anything you were going to get in the draft this year, for sure. Certainly, at least now, there may be guys in the draft who develop, but you weren't going to find a ready-made prospect like that. The Colts also were in a very healthy salary cap situation. So financially, this wasn't really strenuous for them. So they really were in position to make a deal to really strengthen their team. And I think it's going to boost this defense. I like what they have in other parts of this defense, but you can't overcome the lack of that pass rush. And Buckner changes the game.
I'm with you. I love what they did in the entirety of the offseason, free agency, and the draft as well. All right, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Stephen Holder talking Colts 2020. All right, Stephen, we talked about Philip Rivers, talked about DeForest Buckner a little bit and what that offense looks like. For you, in your mind, as we head into hopefully training camp and get the football season going, what's the primary position battle to watch? Maybe 1 or 2 if you have some.
Oh, there's an interesting one, I think, on defense at middle linebacker. So Anthony Walker, who was the leading tackler on this team last year, he's going to be pushed, quite frankly, by a youngster named Bobby Okereke, a second-year player out of Stanford. He was a guy who played some of the strong side linebacker last season. Obviously, in today's NFL, in a 4-3 style defense, you're playing the nickel so much that third linebacker just doesn't play a whole lot of snaps. So they were platooning him and trying to get him on the field. I don't think it's going to be an either-or situation this year. I don't think one guy will play and one guy will sit necessarily. But, we'll have to see how the snaps even out. They're both, I think, very productive players. Okereke has sort of this splash potential, though, that I think Walker does have that, but not at the level I think that Okereke does. And so what Walker brings to the table is just tremendous leadership. a really cerebral approach, understands everything that's happening out there. But of course, Okiriki went to Stanford. He's no slouch either. So I think you're talking about Northwestern versus Stanford, two tackle machines, big play guys. I think it's a position of strength. I think linebacker could be the best position on this team, with the exception of maybe the offensive line, which is obviously quite good. So outside of that, I think there's a couple of other things I'll mention. Cornerback is interesting only because they brought in Xavier Rhodes, and I'm just dying to know what Xavier Rhodes even looks like now, right? So can he sort of push his way back and become or recapture what he had a few years ago as an All-Pro? And then on offense, wide receiver is interesting. They have, on paper, some depth, and we'll see how it all shakes out and who plays where. T.Y. Hilton's still the number one, but Paris Campbell, a name to remember, injured a lot last season. If he stays healthy, I think they have plans for him. But then, as we mentioned, Michael Pittman is ready to roll. He's a guy who can really contribute right away. So, and there are others that I didn't mention as well. So I think that has the potential to be a deep position, and those guys will have to kind of earn their snaps.
It's funny you mentioned those guys' names. I cover the NFL draft for CBS as well. And I remember watching Bobby Okereke at Stanford and being very frustrated by the way he played, but he was so athletic, had such long arms. Yeah. And it just goes to show that you have to give these kids time sometimes. It's not going to happen overnight. And Paris Campbell, when he came out of Ohio State, no one was talking about Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin stayed healthy, had a huge year last year. Paris Campbell is a burner, but he has to stay healthy, to your point. So I think those are some great names that you mentioned, some interesting things to watch. I wanted to ask you quickly about Frank Reich and the Colts release during the draft season. I think they did it last year as well, sort of the behind-the-scenes look at how the scouting staff and the front office and the coaching staff come together. And it's clear that Frank Reich plays a huge part in that. In your opinion, what's Frank Reich do well? Are there any things that he needs to work on? And it seems to me on the outside looking in that this team buys into what Frank Reich and Chris Ballard are selling. Is that the perception you have as well?
Well, I'll start with the second part first. Yeah, there's no question. I think it's perhaps his best quality, I think, is he has a unique brand of leadership. And, the Colts fans locally who follow my coverage, they know that he's got this background in the ministry. He was actually a pastor in a Presbyterian church, which has nothing to do with football. But I actually found a connection there. I think just the ability to listen and to be gracious and to relate to people, that stuff matters. And I think that is what separates coaches who struggle in those areas with coaches who get it and who know how to get the most out of their players because they understand their players. I think there's lots more to the job, clearly, but that's part of it. So I just think, we talk about emotional intelligence, and I think that's a real thing. And I think it's not something you can necessarily pinpoint in a job interview.
Right.
But when the guy has it, it shows up, and his players will tell you they see it. And so I just see just a consistent respect for him across the locker room. And it's so rare you get that in a locker room of 53 guys where they're all, for the most part, as far as I can tell, buying into what the coach is selling. That doesn't happen very often. And even if guys don't say it out loud, you can sense it sometimes. And I have never sensed anything to the contrary here under Frank Reich. So that says something. And in terms of, just his best quality as a coach, what I do think is interesting with him is that he does have this sort of approach. He's talked about this offseason, where we'll do what we have to do to win. And, he's an offensive coach. He doesn't really deal with the defense. But offensively, at least, they have had games. I've documented this recently. They've had games where Andrew Luck may have thrown the ball 18 times. Or I think it was this last season. I went back to 2018. Andrew Luck had a game. I think he threw it as few as 22 times one game, I believe against Dallas. He had another game. He threw the ball 62 times. And so that obviously tells you something about the score and how the game went maybe, but it also tells you that they have a very versatile approach. And I also think that the aggressiveness that Frank Reich plays with, he's one of the coaches who's most likely to go for it on fourth down. He listens to the analytics, very open-minded approach. So I think he's just willing to do what you have to do to win. Doesn't always work. Last year was, rough at times, but certainly, given the right situation, that stuff does pay off. So And that goes to the coach, the team having confidence in him too. They love the aggressiveness. The players, they'll play for you when they feel like, you're going to give them a chance. So I think all that goes into a big pot that makes Frank Reich what he's been as head coach here.
And that seems to be the perception on the outside looking in too. There doesn't seem to be any animosity. And I do wonder what would have happened if Josh McDaniel hadn't turned that job down at the last minute and what things will look like now. Because I think it's hard to argue that Frank Reich isn't the right guy for this job. So, thanks for that. So let's look quickly at what Vegas thinks about the Colts in the AFC South. They have the Colts pegged to win 9 games. That's actually an interesting number. They have them as the favorites to win the division as well, and they have the 5th best odds to win the AFC. So, in your mind, what's like the ceiling or the floor for their win totals, and what would be, perhaps in the eyes of fans around Indianapolis, what would be a successful season for what looks like a brand new Colts team with Phillip Rivers?
So, I would say the floor, I guess, would be, look, they won 7 games last season when I don't think they were that good, just to be completely honest. Well, at least in terms of factoring in all the injuries and everything that happened, quarterback retiring literally 2 weeks before the season, right? So the fact that you didn't have a complete train wreck is probably commendable. So they were 7-9 under the absolute worst circumstances you can imagine, and probably had a couple of games where they didn't really have a good excuse to lose. So, I'm not going to necessarily ignore the 1-score wins that they had as well, the close wins. You can't ignore that. But I think they are a much better team this season, at least starting out of the gate. I think they need to win. They need to be talking about 9 wins as their floor, to be honest. Because if you want to win the division, you can't do it if you're winning, or if you're going 8-8. This division's too good. Houston's going to be there. Tennessee's going to be there. And you're going to have to bring your hard hat, too, because, you're talking about Jacksonville being a physical team, Tennessee being very physical, Houston explosiveness. So, anyway, 9 wins, it puts you in the conversation. I don't think it wins the division, but it puts you in the conversation. So that should be the floor. Can they get to 11 wins? Yeah, they can. Will they? That depends. We talked about a lot of hypotheticals today. They have to turn those hypotheticals into realities, and we'll have to see how that goes. But they have a lot of potential, I think, on the plus side. Whether they tap into it is up to them. In terms of what the expectations here are, I think you're talking about be in the division race and try to win this division. I'll give them this. Look, they're not afraid of those teams, and they've played Houston and Tennessee very well. They beat them both last season, and they should have beaten Houston on the road as well late in the season. That was kind of when it started to go all south there. But look, they know how to beat those teams. They know each other very well. I don't think the Colts are intimidated by anybody, nor should they be. So I think the Colts are going to be in this thing, and I think they have a very good chance to win the division if everything goes well.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. It was great talking to you. I hadn't met you before. This was a great talk. You can find Stephen's work at The Athletic. You can find him on Twitter at HolderStephen. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was fun.